Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial issues with interesting people. And as I've noted many times, I'm just sort of circulating this idea until it becomes the default. We are moving to a slightly different format here, where we just discuss news and interesting items, not daily news necessarily, but interesting items of the week with a series of co-hosts. And the latest in this line of co-hosts is Mary Margaret Olohan. She is a senior reporter with the Daily Signal over at the Heritage Foundation. She's also a fellow with us at IW, and she's done a lot of great reporting. You've probably seen some of her viral stories in the last few years, but I'm really pleased to have her on High Noon today to discuss some of the things that are in the news. So I think we should maybe kick it off with something that is, I think, a sort of growing presence. We've talked a lot on this show about sort of the general cast of the conflict in the Middle East. We've talked about the horrific attacks on Israel, and we've talked about some of the response at home and universities, for example. But in this past week, I have sensed a shift in the protests, and I'm wondering if you feel it too. It seems like it's becoming something that's more broadly like the sort of general leftist street protest, the playbook that we saw in 2020. And my evidence for that is one that we're seeing, and we saw in the past week, the attacks on statues of American heroes once again. So statues in DC defaced. We're seeing, the same kind of low level at times, but nevertheless worrying violence, for example, in DC, breaking rules about, scaling the White House walls. Of course, obviously, if it had been a right-wing protest, then we would expect the book to be thrown at these people. But we have little hope that that's going to happen. And then finally, out in LA, there is this horrible case of this man, Kessler, who, unfortunately, he's 65. He was hit in the head by a pro-Palestinian demonstrator. He was a pro-Israel supporter who was also out there exercising his First Amendment right. He was hit over the head with a megaphone. He fell onto the ground, and he ended up bleeding from his brain, and he died. So that is homicide by most standards and most state standards. So what do you make of all of this? I mean, obviously, we've talked quite a bit, and I'm sure you have thought about this as well over at Heritage, about the connections between sort of our domestic left and this pro-Hamas sentiment and how those two things fit together. But this almost seems to have transcended the specific conflict of the Middle East, because now it seems to me that the targets are all the typical things we hear from the hard left, right? About America itself being a colonialist power and an occupier, about going after American heroes and decrying them as genocidal maniacs, right? This all starts to sound much less specific to the conflict in the Middle East and much more the generic anti-American street protest and violence that we saw in 2020.
No, I totally agree with you, Nez. And I was thinking about this as I was writing about it was BLM support for the attack on October 7th, which, we're backtracking a little bit here, right? Where we had BLM Chicago, BLM, a bunch of different BLM affiliates come out and express support for the attacks. And then we saw a whole slew of student protests and just more tame protests. And now we're entering this era of maybe violence-laced protests, or just at the very bare minimum, much more aggressive protests. But these initial statements blew my mind with the way that they aligned the BLM cause with the Hamas attacks. There was a reference to, and I've heard this at different protests, we're called terrorists, but we know who the real terrorists are. Our land has been taken from us. We've been treated badly. It's an alignment with the same messaging. And so it doesn't surprise me now that we're seeing more this shift in this way, because that's a sentiment that was being expressed even if people weren't necessarily carrying the banner at the beginning of this about a month ago. And it has been actually specifically a month now since the initial attack. And I wasn't able to be at the protest in DC over the weekend, or the demonstration, whatever we want to call it here. peaceful protest.
It's passionate. It's the new notion of peaceful. It's passionate protest.
Passionate protest. I missed it, but I've been at a lot of student protests, and an interesting vibe that I picked up on that I don't know if I've written about this just because it's not necessarily like solid fact is you know, the organizers will say, and typically student organizers, they'll say, we already decided what messaging the media is taking away from this. So I'm thinking specifically of the protests I went to at the Israeli embassy, where there were a lot of adults and students, and then the protests that I went to at GMU, George Mason University in Fairfax. And the leaders will say, we already decided what messaging the media is taking away from this. So don't deter from that. Stick with our messaging. And at both protests, we noticed, my colleagues and I, that there'd be a group of guys, it's much more like you got your typical skinny college students, and then you have these more kind of muscular looking men that are wearing I think it's called a kefra, the black and white headdress.
Yeah.
And they, if they were antagonized at all, or if they felt called upon, they would start saying Allahu Akbar. And the organizers would shut it down. And I found this really interesting because, they got their typical chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will soon be free. They've got a couple other ones, free Palestine. But the Allahu Akbar, no, they didn't want that. And this weekend in the coverage, I saw that a lot. I saw a lot more boldness and confidence in kind of coming out and saying this phrase that wasn't welcome at the other protests, because we all know that scares people, and it aligns with more of a, for lack of a better word, for more of a terrorist ideal than we want to hear from.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was listening to that in the chants as well. In the protests in front of the White House, they were yelling over and over again, Allahu Akbar, right? And it struck me that in 2002, of course, if you yelled Allah Akbar at the front of the White House gates and started to climb the gates, you would probably catch a sniper bullet. But now it is, as you say, has moved into part of this alliance of the left in a way that's much more comfortable. But frankly, inevitable if you look at the writings of Judith Butler or any of these sort of new left sentiment. Even if you go back to Sartre versus Camus, right? Like there has been this long-term alliance between the hard left and what they would call colonial resistance, right? Which I think that tweet at the right after October 7th actually got to the heart of really well, where the professor, I can't remember from what school, she was like, well, what did you think decolonialism looked like? Did you think it was writing essays? No, when you violently displace, quote unquote colonial powers, it's going to be ugly. It's not going to be like a seminar. But there has been this long understanding, and I think it's an obvious one, which is that they have the same enemies. And it almost doesn't matter for these purposes, whether you're talking about Israel or Jews or America, the West broadly. All of these people and entities slot into the same oppressor-oppressed construct, whereby, and you see it applied domestically in the United States in the criminal context, whereby if you are, if you're a quote person of color, if your skin is darker, and you commit violence, then it must be a construct of you're rising against oppression in some way and therefore excusable. Whereas if there's any violence going the opposite direction, in other words, the small number of murders, for example, that are white on black in this country garner huge and disproportionate media attention, whereas black on black murders don't garner any at all, right? And similarly, right, like black on white murders don't garner very, very little media attention. It's that same outsized coverage based on the underlying notion that if you are, brown and therefore, quote unquote, more oppressed, any kind of action of yours is not only excusable, it's laudable, it's placed in a political context of resistance or anti-colonialism or whatever else. And that's exactly what happened after October 7th, right? It's even before Israel did a single thing to retaliate, when they were still dealing with literal Hamas terrorists within the borders, even within the green line of Israel, the like original borders of Israel, it was automatically assumed to be illegitimate, right? Any response to that was automatically assumed to be illegitimate, while the actions, even the incredibly barbaric actions of Hamas terrorists in Israel, were presumed to be an outgrowth of resistance and therefore legitimate. Look, I haven't talked to a single one of these people, frankly, even the more moderate ones, who did not, when asked, agree that America is in the same illegitimate, like morally illegitimate position. I mean, you've been at these protests. Did you ask any of them like what the status of America is in terms of sitting on Indian land or whatever else? What is the status of America as an occupier?
I mean, I didn't specifically ask them that because when we were there, we were really interested in asking people whether they condemned Hamas, because a lot of the protests I went to were really close to the attack, and nobody wanted to say anything about Hamas. You never heard that word, Hamas, which I found wild. And we try and ask the students, do you support Hamas? Why are you guys talking about the martyrs in the attack? You referencing the Hamas fighters that murdered and raped and slaughtered all these people, and they wouldn't acknowledge that. But I will say many of these college students are, and the adults that were at the protest, they are carrying signs or signage, or some of their messaging conflates a lot of these issues in the way that you would expect. So, for example, the megaphone of one of these student leaders had "Queers for Palestine" on it. A lot of that kind of messaging. And I did see signs with references to indigenous peoples' lands. But the disconnect between these young people, especially, and the sentiments they're expressing, and then realities of what's going on over there is so startling. And we even asked people when we said, do you realize that your sign says "Queers for Palestine," but if you had that kind of sign over there, you could be potentially subject to criminal action, or you could be in danger for that. We said it a little more politely than that. And they got really mad at us. They kicked us out. The police had to come in and say, all right, time to go. And there's no recognition of reality in these instances. And I haven't been at a protest where I've seen these more recent ones, and I want to go, but I'm not going to lie to you. It makes me nervous, this conflation, because it's different than, it's different. Like, I go to the abortion protests in DC all the time. I go to protesting outside the homes of the Supreme Court justices and stuff. I've been peripheral to some of the BLM protests back in 2020. Every kind is different. It has a different vibe, different people that attend them, and you can just feel the momentum here. Different crowd. It feels less safe. It feels it just feels more on the verge of something, and it scares me. It really does.
Yeah, I mean, there is something different that hits different about actually cheering for direct violence that everyone has seen. It's one notch less abstract, I think, than some of the previously endorsed, even though I think it follows very, very well. But you kind of touched upon something that has been bothering me in the conversations about all of this. And that is, so the response, and even from conservative Republicans, has been to list off, okay, so why should we Americans stand with Israel? Instead of, in my view, touching on some of the deeper things about Western civilization, it's been a litany of policies that I think now are the only thing that we're capable of articulating, right? It's about democracy. It's about who better recognizes gay marriage, right? And in what country homosexuals are better treated. And it strikes me that this list of sort of freedoms, or for lack of a better word, is the only thing that we have to offer. And then to me, it really just highlights how correct, Houellebecq was to write about basically the soft Islamist scenario in which a soft Islamist party wins, election in Europe due to immigration, and everyone jumped down his throat about, oh, like you're what's the Biden administration's favorite word? You're Islamic phobic, right? When in fact the book was about submission, was about it was about the lack of a moral claim at the heart of the West anymore, right? And the fact that that there's not any, like, we are not asserting any kind of moral goodness of our civilization, and to the extent that we're able to do that, it's not things like, that we have the traditional liberties of American citizens, not that we live under a continuous constitution that restrains the action of government, and not that, and crucially, not that we are a good and moral people who live uprightly without the restraint of government, without that real experiment in ordered liberty, where we can have a civilization that makes a claim about moral truth, that we are like good in this way, because either our connection with Christianity, that's off the table completely, right? The country's connection with Christianity, that we are simply living in a tradition that has granted liberty and prosperity and safety from the sort of state of nature of humankind and the barbarism that's inherent to most of human existence, that we have transcended that and lifted ourselves out of it by adhering, that we have the rule of law. None of these things are what we're talking about, right? We're talking about things that are, okay, we have gay marriage. Like that is literally the dividing line now between, quote unquote, Western civilization and barbarism, or 7th century, style Comanche raids into Israel. It seems like it's a very depressing state to me of, like, we can only articulate ourselves and who we are and what we stand for with reference to maybe the last 30 years, because suggesting that there's anything special about Americans as a concrete people, or that there's anything special specifically about our history, our heroes, our Constitution, all of those things, even the right does not reference when making these arguments.
That's such a good point, and it is incredibly sad that we've gotten to this point where, I mean, to even interact with these kinds of people when they're talking in this way, like, how are you supposed to reach them? I'll try and say, my purpose in going to this kind of protest is to show what's going on, right? Or to show the sentiments that are being expressed here. But if you can't even reach them with the realities of that kind of thing, and then we already have this separation like you're talking about, it feels so hopeless. But I think that's a really interesting point, and we don't talk about that enough. It is absolutely true.
And I guess this is a good way to segue to some of the reporting that you've done about the new speaker, Mike Johnson,
Yeah.
and how the media has really treated him as though he's grown an extra head. With everything they sort of dig up about anything he said in the past about his faith, the reporting makes it sound like any expression he's made of his Christian faith is like just sort of predeterminedly crazy, right? There is a sharp contrast, by the way, between the tolerance of Allah Akbar, right, and the ability to, or the inability to take as just part of the package that this is a speaker whose faith has very much influenced his life. He sees himself and his political decisions as not identical with his faith, but of course influenced by it, as every worldview influences, particularly your moral worldview, will influence the way that you see politics and the world. And there's this presumption that that's illegitimate.
Yeah. It's not just that it's illegitimate, it's that it's not allowed. And that's what I find so interesting. I was talking about this morning. I think I was messaging you about it yesterday. The media illiteracy when it comes to religion is so bad. And it translates to politicians, to commentators, where no one seems to believe that the people who say they are Christian or they're Catholic or they're Jewish or they're Muslim actually believe what their faiths teach. And specifically, media, I have noticed it's kind of like a blanket assumption, like, oh, they're this faith, but then there's shock when they actually believe what they say they do. And I think this is a good example of this is Amy Coney Barrett when she was nominated to the Supreme Court. Everyone was shocked that as a Catholic, she took certain stances or that she had a big family. There's so much shock there. And the media, the way they reported it, was this extreme woman who has all these kids, and she adopted her 2 Black children because she's a racist. And the whole fanfare surrounding her nomination centered on her Catholicism and how that might impact her Supreme Court decisions. But then on the other hand, you have Joe Biden. When we talk about his Catholicism, he's a devout Catholic. Whatever his actual actions and policy aside, he's a devout Catholic, and that's how CNN refers to him. How the AP, every outlet under the sun will call him a devout or practicing Catholic. And then you get Mike Johnson, who wants to protect his son in the age of this degenerate internet that we face. He gets this Covenant Eyes. It's an accountability software, which is really sweet when you actually hear him explain this. Covenant Eyes, where basically you set it up so that it tracks your internet usage and you have an accountability partner. So it tracks both of your internet usage and sends each other a report. And so theoretically, if you're looking at stuff you're not supposed to be looking at, it's going to ping your accountability partner and say, hey, he looked at this today. And Johnson never said that either of them had viewed pornography. He said they have this software to hold each other accountable. And yet the Rolling Stone, I'm trying to remember exactly what their phraseology was, but the headline basically said they're tracking each other's porn usage. I wrote a story about this. I messaged the author. I think his name is Daniel something or other. He normally writes entertainment for Rolling Stone. And I said, hey, do you stand by this headline? Do you realize what it's suggesting? Like, we're going to write a story about this. We're including your name. Can you address whether you stand by it? He never got back to me, but it's just incredible that is how you would frame this. We have, I can spare you out my rant on pornography, but when we know such negative impacts that it has on young people, especially, and you see a father that wants to help his son to just navigate that because of their Christian faith, which says that they shouldn't be using it anyways. And then that's how the media is going to frame it in this hit piece manner. And this kid has to grow up and have all these stories on the internet about him and his father and pornography. It's disgusting. And Johnson, I've seen this on multiple levels with different aspects of his faith. I've seen even conservatives trying to say that he wants his faith teaches that if Israel is obliterated, the end times are coming. So he wants war in the Middle East. All kinds of other attacks in this manner. And just because the man supports traditional marriage, he stands by his faith, oh, he must be a radical. It's crazy. Every time this happens, and it happens maybe every year or so, some prominent conservative will come into the limelight. They're a strong Catholic, strong Christian, and all of a sudden, all the headlines are Amy Coney Barrett is a handmaid, or Mike Johnson uses son's pornography. Like, what the? Sorry, I get way too worked up about all this.
So it's interesting because, like, I recently ran a Twitter poll, which obviously not scientific, but I have a lot of Christian followers, and I was asking them about, like, personally, I don't care if American evangelical Christians support Israel because they thought it was the end of the world, but I had heard this claim so many times repeated both by news outlets like the New York Times, but also like in my personal life from liberal Jews. And I was like wondering how, because I don't care. Even if it were true, I wouldn't care. I mean, I don't care what somebody believes is going to happen at the end of the world. Like,
Right.
The fact that American evangelical Christians are such good friends to the Jewish people is not something that I'm like gonna nitpick in terms of what theological considerations they may have for that. I don't care about those things. But I was curious because, I have worked with a ton of Christians over the years. I've had conversations about Israel with a ton of Christians over the years, and it's never come up. Like this supposedly ubiquitous explanation about the end of the world and that the Jews have to gather in Israel in the end times. And so I was asking my Christian followers, what sect believes in this, what sort of subdivision of Protestantism or evangelicalism believes in this. And so there were some responses that came back. Overwhelmingly, people expressed that the reason that they were supporting Israel were either for cultural and secular reasons, meaning they saw some alignment between their values and the values of America and Israel. The second most popular reason was other biblical reasons, and the two that I heard cited the most and have heard cited the most in my personal interactions with people is one that, the verse from the Bible that says that God will bless who blesses the Jews and curse who curses them. And then the second one was a non-specific to a particular verse, but generally the biblical belief that Christianity is a branch or that Christianity and Judaism share the same root, and therefore that there is a special relationship, kind of like the U.S. and the U.K., right? There's a special relationship because they share at their root, perhaps the same God, but different interpretations of what happened after the coming of the Messiah. But there's some kind of theological overlap there. And that was the second most cited thing that I heard. So then I heard that, my followers were telling me that apparently this view about the end times, the particularities of one equating modern Israel with Israel in the Bible and in prophecy and in Revelations, is itself a somewhat minority view. But then within that, apparently Pastor John Hagee is popular with the Left Behind series, that this is where this particular belief, and there are some people, I want to be clear, like there are, and some of them wrote to me, and there are people who believe that the modern Israel is equivalent to the Israel in prophecy, and that there will be some kind of end of the world base, and it will happen relatedly to what's happening in Israel. Even those people, they're not like, they don't believe that we should start a war in Israel to bring about the end times. They simply believe that there are certain indications that we're headed that way, whether we like it or not. But it was just interesting because this is ubiquitous. I have heard it so many times, and it turns out to be a minority position of an already minority part of evangelicalism. And even that is not fairly expressed in the sort of dominant media narrative about this.
Right, where you nitpick one little thing that you've heard that sounds more radical and you blow it up to represent the overall sentiment in an area to portray it as radical. We see that all the time. This one in particular, I interviewed Speaker Johnson on his faith about a week ago now. And I was pulling it up while you were talking because I asked him specifically about this because I kept seeing it coming up and I thought, okay, I want to know, is that his stance? And he told me that there's obviously a biblical admonition. This is what you were referring to, that all Jews and Christians believe. He said, it says clearly in the Bible, I will bless the nation that blesses Israel and curse the nation that curses Israel. He said it's pretty black and white in terms of our faith. But then he also said there's stacks of pragmatic reasons in our national interests on why we have to stand with Israel. And he explained those to me. So he said, it's always nice when your faith aligns with pragmatic public policy. That was his take on being a Christian and standing up for Israel in this situation.
Yeah, I need to have Walter Russell Mead on because he wrote this book that I've listened to him give interviews about this sort of historical support for Jews and then once past 48 for Israel in America and among American Christians. But yeah, it is a very interesting topic if it were explored honestly, right? So the explorations are always very dishonest, and I've heard from multiple quarters, right? There's the obvious, the one we just talked about, which is reduces it to a particular sort of prophecy of the end times, which the majority even of evangelical Christians don't believe, let alone expanding it out to Protestants and then expanding it out to all Christians in America. Like, again, you're talking about a subdivision, but even that is not really fairly expressed, even for that minority who do believe that. It's not a fairly expressed sentiment to say, because like
Right.
the shorthand I always hear is America and Israel need to stand together at the end of the world, and they're waiting for all the Jews to gather in Israel so that Jesus can come back, which I think is not an accurate, even what this percentage of Christians believe is not a faithful rendition of their theological commitments.
Right.
But even so, like there's a very interesting topic, but this is so pervasive. I have to tell you, this is such a pervasive view, not just among the readers of the New York Times, although there's an overlapping a lot of overlap between the two groups that I'm going to say, but among liberal Jews in America. That like somehow this Christian support for Jews in Israel, the philo-Semitism of American Christians, is like somehow a trick. That it's based on some, what to them, wacky theological considerations, and it is kind of a tragedy, because I see it as a combination of this kind of misinformation about theology that is spread through ignorance in the New York Times and elsewhere, but also something deeper, I think, which is that importing a certain posture that is a result of European experience and pogroms in Europe over centuries, right? And it is importing it into a country in which it never took place. There has never been a pogrom in America, as far as my history knowledge, and I think is correct. There has never been a pogrom in America. That's not to say that there weren't, like, any group, any minority group in America, like, had to sort of find its way into the mainstream. But and then there were certainly like quotas in universities and stuff like that. But this is whole like minor potatoes compared to the fundamental acceptance. I mean, America has been an incredibly safe place and welcoming place for Jews from its inception, starting with Washington's letters on tolerance, right, to the Hebrew congregation. It's an imported history that for many fascinating reasons, of which I don't know, and that's why I need to read that Walter Russell Mead book instead of just listening to him talk about it. But it is an interesting historical aberration, actually, that America has been such a safe place and such a welcoming place for Jews for centuries. And so anyway, the whole thing strikes me as a bit of tragedy, that the majority of American Jews are liberal, and in part because of their liberal commitments, but also in part of sort of this mistranslation of various things, including cultural mistranslations about appeals to conversion. Like there's just this cultural antipathy between, and when in reality, like these are two groups of people who really should be friends. There is a one-sided hand of friendship, many times one-sided hand of friendship extended from American evangelical Christians and American Christians more broadly, and not accepted or feared even by American Jews who are liberal. Right? And Israelis actually don't seem, most Israelis that I know, they don't have this like soul searching about what it really means that American Christians support them. They're like, oh, good, somebody
Right.
supports us.
That's so true. Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly here, I went on the most amazing trip earlier this year with this group called Philos, and it was specifically Philos Catholic, and the purpose of it was to kind of bridge the gap between different Christian or Catholic groups and Jewish Americans and Israelis, and it was so phenomenal. They're doing such great work. This was Philos Catholic took us to Israel, and we went and just learned so much about Judaism, the culture in Israel, the different conflicts that were going on over there. And what I loved about them was they were telling me that in the United States, a lot of the work they do is to extend a hand between Christians and Jews to show them when Jews experience anti-Semitism, they'll send one of their volunteers or their workers to bring a rose to that community, which is this really beautiful little gesture where they say basically, hey, we're here, we're with you, we stand with you. And they were telling me about the reception that gets. They were like, you would not believe just bringing one rose to a family that has graffiti on their home, or just a little incident that people would say, oh, that's rude, but it's not a big deal. these little acts of kindness are their way of kind of bridging that gap. And I thought that was so amazing, that they're making that small effort in that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very Christian gesture. Strikes me. And I mean that specifically, not as like a sort of generic compliment, but it's a very Christian gesture, and I'm sure it's very appreciated. I mean, especially in these times. But what do you think accounts for it it is obviously the hostility of the left to all religious explanation, in terms of the mainstream media. But you would think at some point they would merely be embarrassed, right? Like I'm thinking of all these incidents just off the top of my head that I can think of where mainstream media just straight up made mistakes, like religious mistakes about very basic things. So the New York
Hmm.
Times, during the 2016 election, I remember published something. I think Ted Cruz gave a speech about the body of Christ, and the original story in the New York Times assumed that they were talking about like an actual body, and he was obviously referring to the congregation. And to Christians more broadly in the world. But like they written, I can't remember exactly how they did, but they had written the story in such a way as to to imply that it was like a concrete thing, like they had like a body somewhere in the church, and and it was obviously like just a mere mistake on the part of
Right.
somebody who had absolutely no experience with an incredibly common phrase. And there are many others. I mean, Molly Hemingway has documented a ton of these. And so, what is to be done aside from the general problem, and maybe it's inseparable from it, but aside from the general problem of media bias, because this is beyond media bias, this is like media idiocy or
Right. Right.
the real kind of ignorance that, as we've just been discussing, sometimes really does end up driving a wedge between people who don't know better. And not everyone is familiar with the theology of every, Christian denomination, or for that matter, the differences between Reform, conservative, Orthodox Jews, like traditional and Israel. Like, these are
Right.
things that you only know if you're, interact with them in a direct way, or if you have a particular interest in the theology. But, what can be done to minimize the the mistakes, like the just genuine idiotic mistakes with regard to religion? And why do you think they occur at such a high rate? I mean, we've gone from a country that made biblical reference as part of national politics. Any major speech in American history basically has heavy biblical reference, to the point where, major legacy news outlets do not know what the phrase body of Christ means.
Right. No, well, first of all, those outlets and those reporters need to be held accountable when they do mess up. So I think there's a huge responsibility for the people in the know, as it were, to speak up and say, no, you got that wrong and you need to fix it. Um, and I think that weirdly enough, Twitter has become a huge way that people do that. And I'm really glad to see it. I actually was laughing when you mentioned Molly Hemingway, because I'm pretty sure her husband, Mark, coined some phrase about media illiteracy when it comes to religion. And it's escaping me right now, but it was so good. And I believe what he was getting at is they're not just being biased, like you were saying. It's that they genuinely don't know anything about religion. And and so, where once upon a time, someone would hear Ted Cruz refer to the body of Christ and say, okay, well, is he Catholic? Is he Christian? Because in Catholicism, when you say the body of Christ, you might be
Right.
referring
You're
to
talking about
the
communion. It was, I
right,
can't, I'm phrasing it in a way that's less clear in my own, like, because I'm remembering something, but it was very clear. He was literally talking about like the congregation. He was
right,
speaking to a Christian congregation. But yes, I know that also, in Catholicism, and frankly, in plenty of Protestant denominations, they would also refer to what Catholics would call the Eucharist, right? But whatever, they would refer to the act of communion as, and
right.
the bread and wine as the body and blood of
Body
Christ.
and blood
That
of Christ. Yeah.
also not, I'm pretty sure, something that the New York Times reporter understood,
No.
because he thought there was a literal, like, I don't know what he thought, that there's a statue, because it kind of was, he was writing about it as though it was a statue,
I need
that
to
like
find this
somebody was
piece.
going to carry out a statue, and that was the bot. It was like extremely bizarre, and it didn't fit with any of the
Right.
different
Well, because
denominational interpretations or use or common use of that phrase.
Right, and they don't I think they think of it as the people who believe this are believing in some kind of magic, first of all, that it's like a magical, mystical, or not mystical, but they think it's bad, um, because there's no understanding and there's no respect for it either. But I will say it gives me hope that I don't think that most of America is is, uh, is on the same page. In fact, we know there's so many religious Americans who would read that and just be so turned off and frustrated by it. That gives me hope because I do think we get immersed in the media bubble sometimes, and it is so depressing and discouraging. But not everyone is that religiously illiterate. But to your question about how we address it, I think we need more reporters. I genuinely think we need more reporters, not activists necessarily, but just like men and women that are willing to tell the truth. And nobody seems to care about the truth anymore. Uh, it's something that we talk about all the time, but we have these journalists working for the Washington Post, and they're assigned to cover gender, and they have she, her, or he, him in their bio, they, them. Um, they tweet about supporting, Planned Parenthood if they cover abortion. Like there's just no pretense at impartiality anymore. But then, democracy dies in darkness on the tagline, and if you inquire about it, they'll pretend to be unbiased. Um, and then, you have conservative reporters who, like me, where I'm very open about what I believe. I'm not pretending to be this unbiased Washington Post reporter, uh, but I will try and report on the truth, and I will try and expose the facts in that manner. And I think we need more people who are just being trained to do that and to call out nonsense when they see it. And I know that's not what journalism used to be, but I think we need more of that now, because when someone says something absurd about a religion and prints it in one of the most important papers in the world and it goes unchallenged, well, that's how you change how people view that religion, and that's scary.
What do you think? Where do you come down on sort of the question of bias, inevitability of bias? So you just described yourself, right, as a conservative reporter, in the sense that you're very upfront about your ideological commitments. Do you think it's possible to have quote unquote unbiased reporting, or a more like to the point question would be, do you think that we should strive towards a lack of bias in media, or do you think that we should strive towards a fair, accurate, and disclosure of various ideological commitments, so that the audience is sort of or is there a role for both? In other words, is it necessary to have something of what the AP or the BBC used to be, that is just at least attempting, even when they have their biases? I mean, believe me, the
Yeah.
BBC has their biases, but especially with regard to Israel. But like, it. I guess I'm wondering what the standard in an ideal world. Do you think that to be a good reporter means striving for to tamp down your own biases and straight report the straight news, or do you think that that's a fool's game to begin with, that it's an impossibility, and that what a good reporter ought to be doing is being very honest about his or her biases, and then within those biases trying to be very meticulous about the facts of reporting?
Well, there's definitely people that be really mad at me for saying this. I think in an ideal world, what we would have this unbiased, very straight news reporting of the facts. But I just don't. That world, first of all, I don't think that world ever existed, and I don't think it ever will. We always will be passionate about certain areas, and when you're passionate about it, you feel strongly about it, and so you're gonna have bias creep in no matter how you do it. So I think that yes, we should be more honest about our disclosures, and these outlets should be more honest about donors and their special interests and things like that. But the part of the reason I see it the way I do is that when I first started the Daily Caller, I was trying to get a lay of the land. I was new. I didn't really know a ton about journalism. I got into writing in the first place because of the Kavanaugh hearings. I was in a different line of work, and I was so radicalized by the media coverage of the Kavanaugh hearings that I thought, okay, I can't just sit on the sidelines anymore. I gotta be part of this. And I had an editor at the Daily Caller who's a mentor, I guess you could say, of mine. I asked him, what is our role here? What should we be doing? Like, how should I be covering X news cycle? And he was like, look, there's a lot of outlets out there. They're all covering different stuff. We exist to fill the void that they all leave. And that's what we're doing here. And specifically in that moment, I believe it was covering hypocrisy and during COVID. And I was like, yes, that is what we're here to do, because there is such a huge gap left by all these media outlets and not covering, the hypocrisy of this governor when he says one thing and then does another, or when one woman accuses the president of sexual assault and her allegations get covered up the wazoo, but then another woman accuses another president of sexual assault and everyone ignores her and all the women's groups stay silent. That's where our place, we felt, was to step in and cover those things. And so for me, that's kind of how I've been looking at it for the past, 5 years that I've been reporting, is there's a void. And so we got to fill that. And I guess that's where we're at now. It's so sad that that's how it has to be. But I don't know. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of extra wiggle room right now. Maybe someday there will be, but for the conservative outlets right now, they're just chugging along, trying to tell the truth and fill the void. That's what we got to do.
Yeah, it strikes me that that's an inherently defensive position, right? That it's an inherently sort of ghettoized role for conservative media that relies upon, in some sense, reacting to what mainstream or legacy media is doing. And maybe that's what's necessary. As you say, like maybe it's about filling a hole, but I think it's worth thinking about what the conception of a good media might look like beyond reacting to what the bad one,
right,
what the current one is, especially in light of, I mean, as you say, this has never been actually. I know there's a tendency to say, like, well, it was better 10, 15, 20 years ago. There were fewer news outlets, and there wasn't as much opportunity for outsider voices to step in. On the other hand, they had at least partially this commitment to trying to be relatively middle of the road and covering things relatively unbiased, which are two things that are not the same, by the way, bias and middle of the road, right? Or unbiased and middle of the road. But
right.
They had these commitments that they at least attempted to keep, oftentimes badly. But it strikes me we're moving more towards the 19th century sort of rough and tumble media, where actually most papers were not just connected to a worldview, they were actually connected to a party. So, I mean, it certainly has not always been the case that this sort of Walter Cronkite vision of media was the sort of ideal. But maybe it's all that conservative media can do is fill those holes. But it strikes me that that's kind of that seems to me to be a position for people who assume they're always going to be the losers.
Well, for sure. I mean, it's not a good position to be in. But I think you see, I don't want to cut conservative media short, because you see amazing enterprising reporting coming out of some of these conservative outlets, like Andrew Kerr. I think he's at the Free Beacon now. He's done some of the most earth-shattering reporting of anyone I know, and he's working at the Washington Free Beacon, which I think a lot of people would say is a conservative news outlet. Daily Caller has done amazing reporting, groundbreaking, enterprising reporting. The Federalist, Daily Signal, where I work, everybody's breaking news and leading in various ways, but we're still on defense because these legacy media outlets are what people consider the news. And you see that by how Republicans treat them. The Republicans that you'd think they would want to go to a friendly outlet for their scoops, but no, they give their scoops to Politico, or they give their scoops to the New York Times, or anonymously. They're still giving their good stuff to these outlets because everybody knows they're still top dog. And I'm hard pressed to think of one outlet besides maybe the Free Press, which I would say is left leaning, that does a good job of being unbiased or middle of the road, as we were saying. But that's one of the only ones that I can think of that maybe not even, maybe Semaphore, maybe. But again, they have obvious tilts, and there isn't really any middle of the road outlet that can set the standard there. So yeah, I do think we are on defense. On but I'm gonna give us a little plug here. Kudos to us for still fighting the good fight when we're so deep in the trenches. It's hard, you know. It's hard to break out of there. It's hard to it's hard to even get these mainstream outlets to acknowledge our reporting. I think I reported something recently that the New York Times picked up, and I was shocked, you know, and then they have to say, you know, the conservative news outlet, the Daily Signal, reported. I love it when they have to do that, but it's rare, you know, they don't want to do it. So, anyways, I'm just saying the same thing over and over, but we're filling the void.
Yeah. No. I of course I wasn't disparaging the really good reporting work, not just at the Daily Signal, not just your reporting, but we had Aaron Sibarium on. I know I think it's a great thing that YAF has created this Dow Prize, which is $100,000 prize for good reporting. I think the idea is to go up against the Pulitzer and create some incentives for good reporting and improving. So they gave that Peak Award, the biggest of the awards of the night, to Matt Taibbi, who is by no means a conservative, but did good reporting on the Twitter files and recognition of that. Right. So I do think that it's worth thinking about what our framework is, or what our end goal is, right? And as conservatives in a more abstract way. And that's what I guess I wonder, where, at what point, if there ever will be, there'll be a tipping point. And it certainly seems like independent media generally, including but not, they're kind of overlapping but not identical spheres, right? Independent and conservative media.
Right.
At what point that record low trust in media actually invests new outlets and people who are doing serious, real reporting with the kind of institutional power that, even though brittle, is still matters so much. You just said, right, when it's hard to get your reporting picked up in the New York Times, but then when it's a cause for celebration when they do. That's always going to be the fact that Republican politicians are always going to want to, which is DeSantis is, I kind of think, the one exception.
Yeah.
As a very conscious media choice, like to give exclusives and coverage to attempt to force, but unfortunately DeSantis's position in the primary, I think, forces it, because otherwise, if he were, let's say, for whatever strange reason, Trump wasn't running again, DeSantis was the leading Republican candidate, it would force, right? If a leading Republican candidate were to only give interviews and exclusives to independent and conservative media, it would force the legacy outlets to start reporting, right, on those outlets in a way that almost nothing else would. Because if they want to see what the Republican candidate said and crap all over it, they still would have to go to these outlets, and the access that they continue to have is what grants them a certain amount of power and legitimacy, even as every long-term poll shows that that Americans trust them less and less. But that's a much longer topic for another day. Mary Margaret Olohan of the Daily Signal, she's a fellow with us at IW. Thank you so much for joining High Noon today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.